Okay, so today's the day. I hope you watched the other videos. We are at 3.1, so we're going to jump into HTML, and that is a good and logical first step in becoming a full stack developer. So now we're finally there. We are jumping into code. So please make sure if you watch this that your setup is correct. You find that in the first video, we basically set everything up, and then we basically jump into HTML now. So let's actually quickly get out of here. So I prepared basically the following things. So this is my local host with video. That's how I called it. As you can see, it's in video is my project. So depending on what you're doing, you on Windows you might run something like XAMPP. On here I'm on Ubuntu, so I can basically run that directly, in my local host. It really doesn't matter. So this is my var ww HTML video is this is directly how I'm served in localhost. So this might be CXAMPP video for you, or a CXAMPP htdocs, I think, a video for you. And if you use something else, then do that accordingly. So how you do that is you go on new project and then basically go to the right destination that you need to be and generate that. Again, I called this video, but really doesn't matter. So we want to walk through a couple of basics. So nowadays, thankfully, we're at a state where we don't have to go into the complicated stuff of older HTML versions. So we're going to jump right into HTML5. So in my PHP Storm, what I'm doing is basically I'm simply generating. Why doesn't this work here? Just generating a new HTML file, and here you can basically see how that looks like. And we want to call that index, and that has the following reason. Now, an index file is the file that is basically, chosen by default. So let's just quickly call this test, and then we're going to walk through it. So as you can see now here it says video now. This is of course an empty page, but this exists now. So I don't have to do anything like this, where I say this is exactly the same, right? So I could name this differently, and then I would have to enter it. But we're just going to use the default, and that's why we call it index.html. Now, let's basically look at a couple of topics, and I'm just going to grab my paper here. So I made a couple of notes for today. So the first thing that we want to look at is the basic structure of, okay, what is an HTML document, right? So this is basically a boilerplate you might as well just use. So the first thing, let's actually do this one by one here. The first thing we're going to look at is the doc type. That is basically something that you need to understand, that HTML is more or less just a subset of XML. So that's also how the tags work. We'll go into that in a second. So the only thing that you really want to do is Doctype Html, and that'll tell the browser everything it needs to know. Maybe as a comparison, how that used to look like. Let me just show you. So this is how we used to do it for the longest time, and that, again, I don't even have to go into this anymore, because we don't need that kind of markup ever again. Thankfully, this is the only thing that we need, and that is now an HTML5 document. And again, browser support is there, so you will not have a problem with that, regardless of context. Now, the next thing that we basically look at, and this is basically the standard behavior, is that there are opening tags and closing tags, right? So if I ignore this part, then I basically see, okay, so there can be a tag, and that's now HTML with the language attribute, and this closes again. So every single tag that we will do will always look like this, where I say, okay, tag, and as you can see, it's going to close it again. That is the logical step. Now, there are exceptions to that, but we'll get into it. So this slash tag basically means this is closing this tag. Now tags are nested, as you can see, so everything works inside this HTML document. Basically is everything that we will ever going to write. Okay, so there are basically two sections that you are concerned about in general. One is the head and one is the body. So the head is something that you don't see, right? So title now you actually see up here, but I don't see that in the actual document. So there goes what we call meta information in there. So there's a lot to say about search engine and so on. We're going to jump around that because it's not too important to start. But I mean, as an example, I can basically say, sorry. Oh, come on, why doesn't this work? My autocomplete doesn't really work that well. Interesting. Interesting. Huh. There we go. See, I do this so rarely. It's actually amazing. And then, okay. So there's stuff like that would basically now work for search engines, right? It's like, okay, so what is this site about and so on. So you can read a lot about meta tags. We will do that in a different place. We will basically get into search engine optimization and what we can do here. So more importantly, this is where most of my includes live. So later on, we're going to include different elements like the JavaScript and style sheets and so CSS and so on. That's all going to live in the head. And as you can already see with the meta, you might wonder, like, why doesn't this close? So we have a couple of tags that are self-closing. So in reality, this should look like this. Where we don't really need a closing tag in order to facilitate that. So those are tags that don't have any kind of content. We will look into that. So HTML, for example, as you can see, has content. So there's something nested inside. That's why, of course, it needs to be closed. But if there's nothing that can be inside, then I can basically close it like this, or actually have to. I mean, I can't even close this with a closing tag. So see here, you see it with the title. It has something inside, and that's why we close it afterwards. So that's basically how it works. But again, you can use this as a boilerplate, and you'll be absolutely fine. Now, the important thing happens in the body. So we have basically a couple of tags that you will simply have to learn. Now, we will probably not get into everything that you could possibly do in HTML. What we will try to achieve today is getting you to the point where you can write most of what you need to write and have the ability to have the right kind of terminology that enables you to Google. And you probably, I mean, if you talk to programmers, so here's honestly the most important thing is everything you will ever learn about web development, coding in general, is just a question of okay, how can I obtain information that I'm lacking? Because you will never know everything, but depending on your Google foo, as somebody called it, you can achieve a lot by asking the right kind of questions. So, for example, let's start here. So the body is again, this is what we would see here. So let's just say we want to start with a headline, right? So I'm going to call this the H1, and here we're going to say headline. And here we basically see this. And then now we have a headline here. So as you can see, it's rather big. if I were to write regular text, which I can, I would see how the difference basically renders. Now, we should never have anything floating around freely in body, but that's a different story. So I would do this in a p tag, but let's ignore that for now. So let's first look at what's happening here. So we have the same principle. So the opening tag is an h1, so headline 1, then the content, and then the closing tag. Now, that is a so-called semantic tag. That's important to understand, that there are semantic tags, and they would describe what kind of content we're holding. So in this case, this is a headline, right? So this is a headline up to the power of 1. So we have multiple of those. So this is 1 to 6, but I mean, let's call this subheadline, just so you see that. So this would be interpreted as, like something that is semantically below the H1, right? So in a search engine, and also in the content, like this would basically be, okay, not the main headline, it's a headline that describes basically, something that's structurally under headline 1. So they go down till H6. I mean, I'm not going to do that here now. And what you see is that the default rendering, so again, we're not talking about styling today, but the default rendering already accounts for semantics, right? So this would be bigger than this. So I want you to take that with a grain of salt, because we will never let the browser decide how to, show something. But for now, it gives us the first idea of, okay, so this is apparently more important than this. And that makes a lot of sense. Now, especially in HTML5, a lot of new semantic nomenclatures came to us. Let's start with the regular ones, though. So there's something called a paragraph, right? So a paragraph basically contains some text. And this would basically be a regular text flow here. We say like, okay, so this is basically a paragraph. And now what we can do nowadays is to basically give more information on how things relate to each other, right? So for example, we could say, yes, so this is a self-contained, there are more of those elements in our page, and this is self-contained, and this is actually, the whole thing is an article. Whoops. Right, the whole thing is an article. Going to remove that in here, and so this will not change anything from our end, other than, interestingly, it's interpreted a little bit different. But the browser now understands, okay, this is a self-contained, information, and if there's another article, it's also self-contained information, even though they might be on the same page. And that's interesting for, crawlers and search engines and all kinds of things. But it's also logical from a structural standpoint. Now, the most important thing, and I cannot emphasize this enough, because this is what beginners always do, is they neglect indentation. So as you can see, the IDE has done that for me automatically, and basically now indented what is basically in the article. So as you can imagine, if things get more complicated, then that is such a valuable tool. And you see that a lot in code where people completely neglect that. And because we could have things in here that are, let's make an example. So let's just say we would have a table in here, right? That actually make it like this and say section 1, section 2. I'm going to explain this in a second. Okay. So there's a basic table structure, and we can see this gets deeper. Right, and we would, if we wouldn't have indentation, if all of that would be here, we would basically freak out if we had to read and maintain this and say like, I don't understand what's happening here. But if you indent it from the start, you will basically learn to grasp, okay, this is what's happening, and so on and so on. So since we already have a table, and nowadays, honestly, we'll get to the point where tables will be almost irrelevant because we would probably use like either grid system or flex, and I mean, you wouldn't really do this too often anymore. But let's say you write an email. So the table again, so you open it, you close it. This is then there's a table row, right? So that would be our first row here. So there's a table row, and then basically the difference between th and td is th is for header, right? And this is for regular cells. So if you imagine something like Microsoft Excel, for example, right? So this is a cell, and this is the head. So I have in row 1, I've got section 1, section 2, right? And in row 2, I've got cell 1, cell 1 and cell 2, which basically means if I want to structure the table the other way around, the only thing I really do, let's do this. Let's do this like that, just as an example, and then we have this here. See that? Now we have it structured like this. So there's a lot to be said about like how to make a table look good and so on. But again, like tables are a little bit irrelevant nowadays. I mean, they're way more interesting tags that you go through on a different basis. So they're also, like we've talked about, semantic tags now. They're basically also tags that do not tell the browser what kind of content we're dealing with, but nonetheless they're important in order to place something, to style something, to work with something that is contained in whatever form. Now, some of those we use because we specifically want to target them by styling or whatever, and some of them are declarative of a different type. So let's, for example, do this and say, let's ignore the whole table. Now, oh yeah, one more thing maybe about indentation before I'm done here. So there are things that are debatable, and like for example, like if you see me do this, because a paragraph is something where I expect more text to happen, right? So this would be something like that, and then it's nice to read. However, there are people that argue it should look like this. And in my mind, this is a question of taste. I mean, there's also, of course, this version and so on. You can argue about that when it comes to indentation, right? And I will honestly not have an opinion here or dictate my opinion. But more importantly, like, be aware that the eye will slowly learn how to work with indentation. So what's important is that you don't have something like this, right? This is actually terrible, right? So you don't want to do that. And so I personally do it like this because I think it's more readable. But again, I mean, there are different versions of that. But I mean, if you see like it's contained. So what do you do if it's a long headline, for example? Right? Do you write it like this? Right? Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's something that basically they're different trains of thought. Now there's something like code style when you work in a company and so on, and there are different code styles, and they would define such things, and you should adhere to it, of course. But the more important thing that I want to tell you right now is that you work with general indentation that is easy to read. Don't just do stuff like this. That's going to be an absolute issue even for you in the absolute short run. Now, anyway, how would that look like? So we have this. So as you can see, there are no line breaks like I have in the code. And this is actually pretty logical because I haven't defined them. you see that? So why would it break? Just because it's broken up in the code, there's no logic for the browser to do so. So we can address this in multiple ways. So we can either, like against stylet and so on. But just as an example of a self-closing tag, this is a line break. And again, I would opt for this so you visually understand what's happening. So a line break would then, let's look at that, basically place this line break here, right? And say, okay, now please break. And then basically the new line gets started. And of course the rest happens here as well. You see that? So this is a self-closing tag. We will see that a lot when it comes to forms. It's actually the most interesting part. Now, the tags I want to talk about here that are a little bit open and up in the air can fulfill two things, right? So one of them would, for example, be something that is traditionally used by the browser as italic, for example. Right? So here you can see it's italic. The reason why again you wouldn't see that so often to be used in that way is because later we will learn that a lot of icon fonts and so on use that tag to basically, or misuse that tag if you want so, to work with that. But as you can see, this is not a semantic, right? There's nothing that we say like, okay, this has a particular reason to be styled like that. We don't know that as the browser. Like, why is this supposed to be italic? There's nothing that we can say about this. We can also do this a little bit different and say, for example, okay, this is a span, right? So in the span, first of all, I wouldn't see anything. There's no difference to that whatsoever, right? So why does this tag exist? Well, this tag exists just like other tags that we're now going to talk about. So I can target something. So what if I want to target some in a particular way? And I'm going to give you an example here, quick and dirty, and say like, okay, because this has actually the color red, right? And we're not going to write inline styles, but just so you understand. So all of a sudden this is red. And since this is within the paragraph, I have no other possibility to target this specific sum here other than placing it in a tag, right? So we have a lot of those. The most foremost, and you will see this probably the most, is the so-called div tag. So this is basically used for any kind of layout and structure you will find throughout the internet is our so-called div tags. So they per se don't really say anything about what's the content. But to give you an example, I would basically say, okay, so this takes up the whole line. So I now have like in a div, there are another two divs. See that? So they have line breaks, but they actually don't. What in reality happens is, and here you can see that, is that I take in. Oh yeah, actually, let me introduce something to you that you will need to work with. So every browser right now, I'm using Firefox, but I mean Chrome and Firefox are basically the best options for developing. See here can basically follow the structure and understand what is happening, and you will have the same in Chrome. And there are a lot of reasons. It's very arguable which one is the better browser. There are a couple of things Firefox does for the developers that Chrome doesn't. Most of the things Chrome does what Firefox doesn't. Either choice is fine. It's also good, and you see that basically when I hover this here, it recommends me to basically check out this web page in these three browsers, because sometimes for you write code that where you're not sure, like this, do all browsers behave the same way? Browser support is a bigger topic in detail when you have like more complicated things happening. Not in this scenario here though. So what you can see here is that these div sections here, they take up the complete horizontal space. See that? And that's basically very interesting as a behavior, because we now have the possibility to change that behavior. So we could, for example, like this div here, that you see the blue space it's basically occupying, and then we structure this in here. We could have a different behavior in this and style this accordingly. And this is how grid systems normally work. So we're going to get into CSS in a different level, but I mean, just for you to present you with that understanding, that is why you see a lot of diffs, is so that we can now basically work with this and structure it the way we want to, right? So I could say something like style display inline, and then here style, whoops, with 30%, and here's this style with 30%. So what that would give me, oops, I actually placed this in the wrong logic here, my bad. My bad, sorry. And all of a sudden you would see it behaves completely differently. So this now takes up 30%, this takes up 30, it doesn't even, why not? Oh no, this is as small, isn't it? Yeah, okay. And you have the possibility to structure things, next to each other and so on. So this could be two articles, cards, all kinds of things. But that's not how we're going to work with, again, the inline styles. I mean, this is so dirty. That's the reason why I'm not comfortable with it myself, is because that's not how you write. Just wanted to give you that example. Again, div you will see the most. Now, let's talk about functional tags that are structured in a particular way that they depend on each other. So, for example, let's do two things. The first thing we probably want to do is a video. So I can place a source in here, as you can see. But what I can also do is to place a source basically inside the tag, or have particular things here. So the SRC, that always stands for source. So here we'll put my video source, and then we'll play accordingly. Unfortunately, I don't have a video here. Hold on. Yeah, let's just place this here for now. Oh, it doesn't allow me to do that. Yep. Okay, not sure why it doesn't do that. Hello? My God, because it's huge. That was a mistake. Okay. It's a huge video. Okay, but it doesn't matter. So what you see here is that the video is basically playing, or trying to play, because it's way too big. It's an MP4, so it should work. Doesn't though. Hello? Oh, let's give us some controls here. Ah, there we go. Okay. So that's basically something that we might actually look into. Is like how does that kind of stuff work? But then most importantly, we have something like form. Actually, let's we don't have that. You know what? Quickly do this. This will be a little bit confusing for you, but just do really doesn't matter at this point. Oops. Really doesn't matter at this point. Okay. Now, the form tag is probably the most common input that you will ever have for a user. So let's just assume that what we want to have here is type text. Yeah, that's fine. And then name is let's say test. And then we're going to have this. Okay, so as you can see, there are inputs, like there are tags, and those are all self-closing tags. Again, I apologize for how that is set up. This makes more sense for you to understand what I'm talking about. And missing associated label. Okay, that actually makes sense. I'm not gonna make this too complicated here. Sorry, let me just prepare that and do it like this. Okay. Now the input that we have here. So this is the actual input. It's a self-closing tag, and this would basically here be the submit. So if aware, what's happening right now is that all of this basically talks to this outer tag, if you want so. So from a perspective of something that we call the DOM, so the object model of the structure here, it would understand that this is associated with this, which basically means if I click the submit button, then this form will submit. So in that case, it's going to go to test PHP. It's going to be a method get. We will see what that means in the browser up here. And I basically have the test and can define the value of test now. So later on, when we look into the backend, that will be super interesting to handle that. So let's just say we're going to write a test here and say like, hi there, and press go. So what's happening is that this sends to the test PHP, but what you can see up here is that I basically send over that information. So test equals hi there, right? That's exactly what I did. See? I can actually do this. Sorry. Let's do this differently. Do this differently. Okay, so now I can influence what stands on here, right? So if I were to go back and set, hi there, my friend, then you would see this now gets passed over to this, well, in that case, other file. Now, why are forms that important? Well, because again, forms are your main form of input. So whatever you see when you actually operate the internet as a user, then you must, whether or not, you know, like you have a scroll bar, not a scroll bar, a range bar, whether or not you have a drop down, whether or not you have a select, whether, I mean, however that looks like for you. So again, we can style this pretty freely. At the end, most of the input that you do as a user is either a form or, well, basically, or a click, or you know, or a button of some sort. So let's quickly talk about, before we go into forms too deep, let's talk about what attributes are. So as you can see, so something like an H1, I mean, and we had that, you know, in a couple with styles and so on. But here, this is just the tag. There's nothing else in here. There's nothing else in here. So that doesn't mean that there cannot be anything else in here, but there's nothing else required in here. So with some tags, that is simply not the case. So for example, the form, it doesn't make any kind of sense. You can have just a form, but it doesn't make any kind of sense without, defining these attributes, right? So you would have, in that case, for example, a form has a method. It's either get or post, and it has an action. So that's basically the endpoint it's going to target. So in JavaScript, you will sometimes not see this here, because we're actually going to grab, the content of the form and do something with it, but that's a different story. On a general basis, this is how an attribute looks like. So same with the input. So if the input doesn't have a name, test, then I also cannot grab it here, right? This is okay, here I want to have the test. So again, there are different methods of grabbing this information here. This could have an ID. This could be bound, by a framework. I mean, there's so many ways. But what I want you to take away from it is that there are attributes that are standard. They're standard, and depending on the tag, there are different things that are standard to a tag. So, for example, let's actually have a look at this input. So we have a type submit, which basically all of a sudden makes it something like a button. If I have a type text, it's obviously more like an input field. See that? So if I change the type accordingly, so let's, for example, do the following. So I'm going to define this as required. In HTML5, I don't have the need that every attribute does have this format of equals. So there are multiple ways of writing this. This is actually the classical way of writing this field. But of course, it's a little bit nonsensical and redundant. So eventually they decided to say, like, you know what, this is fine. And this is something that HTML introduced in general. So what you can also do is you can do this. This works fine. And you can also do this. This works also fine. Now, I know that this looks convenient, right? And a lot of people love this kind of markup, but don't forget that you can have problems with that. So depending on what you do, so I mean, in this case, it's really not that important, but in a different form. So first of all, what you can't do is you cannot have any kind of spaces in here if you don't have the quotes. And then the next thing you will notice that if you use something like JavaScript later on, where you might have something like a function that you call right in here, or you have a template system that so on, like this just produces problems. I mean, I'm not sure why they introduced the different quotes. So the double quotes here is honestly the most logical choice that you have, and your IDE would probably do this anyway for you. So I mean, it's not that you type those quotes, and that's why I would not recommend to use the single quotes or have no quotes at all. I would not require that. I would really not suggest that. But of course, if you don't have a value to an attribute, so that's always the value to an attribute, then that's absolutely fine. Right? Absolutely fine. So let's talk about a little bit of why doesn't this even. It's interesting that it doesn't clear that. Let's talk about something else and say, okay, so an input can have a value, right? I'm going to call this standard value, and if I refresh that, then I'm actually really confused why it doesn't refresh that. Why would you behave like that? Really weird. Okay, I need to disable the cache. Hold on a second. I can take care of that later. So as you can see now, the value is pre-filled, even though I haven't typed this. And you might basically see this a lot. So I can basically pass values in here that are also like interpreted relatively normal. This is normally not, so if you're wondering about that behavior, you see stuff like that a lot, and then it kind of vanishes if you input yourself something. That is not a value, that is a placeholder. So Jesus, okay. Okay. Should have some more coffee here. So now you can see it's a little bit grayed out, and it's not really a value. So as soon as I put in here, you can see that, okay, this is not the standard value. This is just a placeholder, right? Where I can basically go back in and do this. So the reason why this is red now is because I said, okay, this is also required. And then the browsers have their own implementations of that. I can catch that in a different one. But here, if I try to submit this form, it will probably tell me, nope, this is a required field. You cannot progress unless you basically fill this out. Now with HTML5, we introduced a lot of things where in HTML, I can directly say what basically makes a good input, right? So the classical way, for example, here would be a min length of 5, let's say. So I mean a minimum of 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, which, ooh, doesn't respect it. Interesting. Doesn't respect it. Let's do the HTML5 version and say we need this. So this would now work, I hope. Yeah. Nope. D5. That's not how you write it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Uh-huh. I doubt it. Yeah, okay. Makes sense. It's a regular expression. I don't want to get into that, but I have possibilities to basically directly in HTML, and again, we will probably at the end of the day never do this, but sometimes it makes sense. Can basically validate what kind of input we're allowing here. So in that case, I say, okay, please make it exactly 5 numericals, right? So digits, if you want. So so that's basically what I want to say about attributes in general. So you also saw the warning that I got before from the label and ID, from the label and input. So this is the label, and this is like for screen readers, this is very important that there's a distinction. So if you basically want to be compliant with screen readers, so let's just take this out for now. And what you now see is a missing associated label. So the label's still here. We will not see any kind of change in how this looks like, right? But now semantically, there's no connection between those two. And I can do this, let's say for test, and I can give this an ID test. So now this warning disappears, and now it's understood that, okay, this is the label for this input, right? So now it will be understood that there's a connection between, okay, this label for this input. Now, if we're already talking about that kind of stuff, let me actually maximize this. So there's a whole section you might basically want to look into, and that is the whole area attributes you can give it. So this would basically be something that's interpreted by screen readers. So if people are blind and so on, that is something that is really interesting. I would highly recommend to cater for that. I mean, you might even get warnings by some frameworks if you don't. And it makes a lot of sense to be inclusive. The web is something that even from a legal standpoint, I mean, it's also required if you have like companies of a particular size and so on. But also just from a human perspective, like you want to basically do this. So if you, for example, say like I don't have a label, right? But this is going to be something that somebody needs to understand in order to fill this out. And because I have a placeholder, see, I have no warning. See that? There's no warning of this. And that is because that's also fine. To say, okay, I've got only the placeholder with the standard value. So in that case, you would basically, for the people that can see something, you would basically place this instead of a value, right? Fill out test here. Right, so, right, you've seen that, you know, email name, whatever, and do this accordingly. So when we come to patterns, again, this was a more complicated subject. So what we can also do with inputs is we can define what kind of type it is, and there are a couple of types also that HTML5 introduced that I can basically say, hey, this has kind of a standard format here, right? So if I now say like, okay, not an email, right? It would still do it, but why would it still do it? Here we go. This is my caching problem. Then basically, as you can see, no, this is not the right format. But if I say sum@email.com, oops, it would allow me to progress. Right, because now I basically defined this as an email. So not all of those are reliable. So there's, for example, stuff like tell. So if you say like I need a particular format that it has because I don't know, I live in the US and I want to have a mobile number, like whatever, this will not be sufficient. You do validation is a whole concept of its own. How to you make sure that you've got the right stuff or credit card numbers and so on. But actually, that's an interesting point. Yeah, let's look at so why is this interesting is mainly for mobile, right? So if I do stuff like number, you will see that the way this behaves is very different. So if I try to input a telephone number now, that where I say like, okay, this is 75 whatever, it will basically say no, this is not a number. So I cannot make this happen. With a telephone format, if I have the type number. On the other hand, that's why I need tell. But tell and number, what they do is on a mobile device. Now, if the keyboard opens up, and that's very convenient, I see the numbers and not the alphabet in order to provide this with an input. So for those kind of reasons, you want to always basically make the right choice on what you have here, right? So, I mean, there's stuff like date, of course, right? Where you see this, right? Okay, this is now the browser implementation of how that looks like. Again, you normally never use this and basically say, I've got something way cooler planned for whatever reason. But as a fallback, this basically works just fine. And depending on where you are, you know, this looks different, of course, in iOS and so on. And you can basically work on that. Accordingly. So the maybe here one more thing that we need to address is that the input type submit is also something that is relatively unusual to use. The reason is that we normally have a particular design set for how certain things look. So it is pretty likely that how you submit a form looks exactly like a link or a button or whatever. So instead, what I will do is I create a button that also says go. And I'm going to give this a type submit and get rid of this. So this doesn't look different, but as you can see, it now has basically the, it is now a button. So if I have a particular style for it, this is how my buttons look like. It is just easier to work with that. It will do exactly the same. So I can, oh, it's actually required. Hold on, let me choose this. And so it does exactly the same, but it is not an input, it is a button. So far to that. So we're going to go a little bit more into the common attributes. One more thing that we probably, since we are talking about forms, is okay, so not everything is an input, right? I have actually a couple of things that are quite common. Let's do one more thing though that's quite interesting, how that would go. So I can also have basically something that doesn't even look like an input, you know, that is very, very different from how it behaves. This is a radio button, right? There's something like a checkbox, right? So this would look like that, and so on. You know, yes, terms and conditions applied, and so on. And the values that they set are, if you're not using any kind of JavaScript framework, is more or less a true or false, so yes or no. So far for that, but let's keep it standard for now. But then they're then they're basically form elements that aren't even inputs. So the most common one that you know is probably a select one, right? So here I have again a name. I'm going to call this select, and it suggests to have an ID. I'm going to ignore that for now, and instead say option, and the value is 1, and the value is 2. Actually, let's make it like this. Okay, so let's quickly look at how that looks like. You can see here drop down of 1 and 2. Now there are a couple of things that you probably notice here. So the first thing that you notice is, so this select basically has elements that are basically their own elements that are completely within the select, right? Do you see that? So that makes a lot of sense. So the next thing that you notice is like, okay, so it shows me 1, 2 numerical, but the value is 1 and 2 written. So why is this very, very interesting? It is because imagine something like well, you know, for example, want to do something like translate that, right? Right, stuff like that. So this is not necessarily what you want to work with. So on your backend side or whatever you're going to do with that form, this might be standardized, but I mean there might be different solutions on how you want to show this. So it makes a lot of sense that this is divided. And again, there are a lot of attributes you could give this. Let's for example call this selected, right? Which no, that's boring because that's standard. Let's do this selected. Oops. Right. So what's going to happen now is that I need to get rid of the cache, that this is pre-selected. So even though the choice is 1, 2, I don't see 1 first. This is already selected. So this is active. If this is where required, this would already be chosen. So unless I change it, the value of this is 2. Right? What I can alternatively do is I can say this is disabled. And so here I cannot choose this. Right, and you see this sometimes basically is used for trickery. So what you sometimes see is something like this, right, where you say, and this is where you see that you know how creative people are. Please choose a number, right? And then And so this basically, I see I cannot choose this, of course. This is basically misused as a placeholder, and I can only choose 2 in this instance. Say like, no, this doesn't work, this works. And I mean, there are a couple of validation issues with this approach, but really doesn't matter. What I want to show you is that you can do a lot of things just by working basically with this, right? And here the same applies, by the way. Here I have a warning that basically tells me that I have no label. Let's do this, and then it should be fine. Okay, so far for that. So the select, then the next thing that we want to talk about is probably a text area. It's also interesting because the text area works completely different. This is, let's call this message. Oops. Let's get rid of the ID again here. Instead do the area label message. So tell us something. Okay, so what would you have? All of a sudden you basically have, ooh, where's this? Ah, see, that's interesting. Interesting behavior. Really interesting behavior. So what you have, let me actually maximize this for you a little bit. What you have here is something that's also part of the form again. It's a little bit of more text, and here I say like, okay, how many columns does it have and how many rows does it have? And you will probably, you see that as a fallback, but of course that's again something where we say like, no, in my HTML, I'm not going to have any kind of style, right? I'm just not going to use this. And so you might as well get either what I mean, I forget the columns, but I mean the let's have the rows. It's something like standard, so when it renders, it at least has something going for it, and then we would basically say no, this works differently. Like we're going to design that in a different way. And as you can see, this is basically resizable. I can also prevent that or allow that. This normally makes sense depending on, because you have to account for different devices and so on. So, but you have a lot of possibilities with the text area as well. So those are basically the main elements of a form, if you want so. And again, I mean, we haven't talked about all the types of input. We haven't talked about, you know, what can be done in well, all kinds of different scenarios, like how they can be styled and so on. But there are basically 2 things that I would like to add to this before we jump into CSS, and that there are some attributes that you will see all over the place, and one of them is ID and the other one is class. So what's important to understand is that an ID is unique. You cannot have 2 IDs that are the same. So if I, for example, say, okay, this text area gets the ID test, right? So as you can see, this is already, no, this generates a hard error here. I can see that here, see duplicate ID reference. Because, so an ID is really something that can only be applied to one particular element. A class, however, right, when I say class test, and let's do a class test here too. And this is a terrible naming. We should actually talk about naming conventions as well, but let's forget that. Then that's fine, right? So there are particular things I can basically do with IDs and with classes. So as a rule of thumb, classes are intended to be reused, and you would apply styling to them. So in CSS, we will later basically talk about this. For now, let me just do a little bit of an example here and say, okay, so class test is, I don't know, font weight is okay. Let's make this bolder, right? And okay, so what does that mean? This basically means that, okay, all of a sudden you see that this is bolder, right? This is bolder. See that? You write bolder. And so I can reuse that class and apply it to wherever it needs to be applied to. An idea, of course, is something that I do in order to target a specific element. So, for example, we have this here with the we got rid of the label, but if let's actually do this again. So here, what is this here? Test field. Here now the for would basically associate with the ID test. So remember, this is how we basically connect it together. Especially in JavaScript, you will basically see that this is always used to pick a particular element. So a unique element that we want to grab and do something with it and change it whatsoever. Now, whenever you see styles are applied in CSS to an ID, in CSS or whatever, it's relatively questionable. You never need this. It's probably a design flaw, but there might be good reasons to do so. But I mean, normally, I would say classes are meant for styling, IDs meant for functionality. So, speaking about that, there are two things that you might encounter when you get into this. So the first thing that you might see sometimes is that there are attributes that are kind of weird. So they start with data, and that could, for example, be a data tool. Okay, really doesn't matter what it is. So a data set is basically something that is attached to the element as additional information on something. So I mean, in JavaScript, I will then later have the ability to, for example, grab the value of this input and so on. And I can also supply, for example, hey, by the way, please save the value tool to the dataset tool. This comes in handy for a lot of things, but if you Google it, of course, there's no such thing as data tool. This is something that is custom, and depending on the framework, this might even be completely custom, right? So you will also see something like tool, which right now is unknown, but as you can see, add tool to custom HTML attributes. So the IDE already understands, no, this could exist in theory, I just don't know anything about it. And so that's a non-standard declaration. And this goes so far that even the tags themselves can be custom, right? So there can be something like my tag. And this will, by the way, render fine. Here is my custom tag. So just to basically prove my point here, this will render fine. The browser doesn't understand anything about it. Might as well be a diff right now. But it's important to understand that, no, this could exist either natively with something that we call web components, a custom element, or by some kind of framework like I don't know, React, Vue.js, you name it, Angular. And they could, of course, also then have custom attributes that you can't find. So what I'm telling you is, if you start to Google particular things where it's like, oh, this looks cool, like how's that done? And you can basically, I mean, that's the next thing that you're probably going to do, right? Is you go to something like GitHub, right? And you say like, oh, I like how this looks like. So how are those icons generated, for example? And then you can basically look it up and say like, okay, this is a particular SVG here. In a diff, as you can see, it has a particular class, see, text gray, and so on. And it's funny, it actually looks a little bit like Tailwind or something. Anyway, you can basically, where am I here? the shadow done? Okay. This is probably a custom element, the whole thing. But you can basically start, you know, finding stuff in websites that you like, and basically check like, okay, how's that done? Because now I can look up everything, right? So what does this mean, for example, like the class text gray, and you will basically see, well, text gray light, here it is. This is this color, right? And you can basically, I mean, I know now it seems a little bit weird at the beginning, but you will be able to basically dissect a lot of those things, and you will find elements where you say, okay, if I Google that, it returns nothing. And that is just something that I want you to be aware of, that can happen. And it's you know, it's then either a custom element, well, it's definitely a custom element of some kind, either native or by a framework. Okay, so far so good. Now, the whole gist of you know what we've done so far is, of course, that you now have you know, like the basic tool set to basically structure something. So to be honest, without CSS, everything you do is going to be pretty ugly. I mean, as you can see, this is not exactly how we want a website to look like, but you can start playing around with the structure and basically already a plan for you know, okay, so what's going to be your first project, right? So we said that we're going to have a music, basically a music library that we're going to work with, and in that music library, we probably need to input new music as we go, right? So we already definitely need a form where we say like, okay, so if this needs to work somehow, I need to be able to input, you know, the artist, the name of the album, and the name of the song, and I don't know, whatever else I want to have, right? Maybe the year. And so that's something that I can now already build, and you can start playing around with things. And if you find yourself having trouble with you know, like with semantic structure, you now should have basically the tool set to be able to start, you know, to Google how things can work. And you know, like I mean, a lot of things are tags that you can use, you know, for all kinds of purposes. I mean, again, it's a very long list, and it really doesn't make sense to go into a certain level of depth yet. But what I really want you to understand at this point is the difference between the different kind of tags and how things are structured, right? So I want you to start to be able to read that and say, okay, this is what's happening. So here, this is the body, this is the content, right? This is like, sorry, let me get rid of the style. This is the content, and this is what's happening, right? Those are tags that, you know, like close here. Those are self-closing tags, right? This is how it's structured. This is within the form. Like, you need to be able to read and understand this. Okay, this is what's contained in this form, and so on. And then you can basically start to generate your own stuff. I know it's a little bit overwhelming at the beginning, but believe me, it is really super simple. And if you're using as I suggested, the PHP Storm, you might have noticed that you know, a lot of the things I don't really write. And later on, we will not even write, you know, that stuff. We're just going to write content and templates. But it's interesting to understand that a good IDE will help you a lot with you know, what you're trying to achieve, right? So if I basically I start writing something like a button, and so I hit tab in that case, and then it creates the tag. So if I write a BR, it understands that, no, this is a self-closing tag, right? So the button, I just hit space, and it already tells me this is all the stuff it can possibly have natively, right? So I can basically start to say like, okay, this is a type, see, just T, and it's suggested to me, enter. Okay, those are the possible values, submit, button, reset, right? That is basically what I want to do. And that's specifically if you need something to where it works. So I mean, one of the things that we probably want to have pretty early is, for example, an image. And so I just write the img, hit tab, and as you can see, it already tells me, hey, this should have at least a source, right? And an alternative if it cannot be loaded. Let me quickly do something here so we can let me copy this in here. Yeah. So there's something to be said about paths. That's actually probably something that I should end with. So as you can see, also when I start typing it here, it suggests me what I need to do. So this now exists, and this is a poster, right? So let's quickly go over here and say, okay, how would this look like? Now I can basically see the image. So this works because right now the where I am is relative, and that's you will basically see that they're relative and absolute paths is what we call them. This is now relative to where I am. So the index HTML here and the poster, they live in the same folder, and that's why I can access it like this. So if I had a cleaner structure, which I should have, let's call this assets, and say, okay, so this video, actually, this video I'm just going to delete because it's too big, sorry about that. And the poster, yeah, that moves in here. So now I have that in assets, right? So this will stop working here immediately. No, it's not, because it's cached. Oh, no, it actually changed it automatically. Okay, as you can see, I now go to assets and then to WebDev poster JPEG. So you will also see a lot of this stuff. So when you refresh this page, this will still work, because what I'm doing here is to basically say, okay, please go to the beginning of the so-called web path. So the web path in my server right now is this video, right? So this becomes tricky when what you see here is not really where you are in what you're writing. You see that a lot in blogs and so on, where basically this is a URL that is not really a .html. We will also see that in our application, right? So what you can also do alternatively is we can define a base. And as you can see, this has an href. And if I, for example, now I have localhost video, I can do this absolute, let's say, okay? So I'm going to say HTTP localhost video, okay? So what's going to happen now, this will still work, right? Actually, let's make this even funnier and say asset. So I should never do this. This shouldn't. I mean, this is, please don't use this example. But oh, it actually works. Oh, because I have this. Okay. Sorry, because I'm using this. Why does this work? It doesn't respect it because it's absolute. Okay, I'm actually surprised that that works. Interesting. Okay. That's probably just for include paths. Well, okay. So, well, this doesn't work, of course, right now. So the pathing again is something that you always have to be careful of whenever you provide a source. Is to say, like, okay, I need to be able to point to exactly where this is. And again, here we have a very straightforward example, but it could be more of a problem if, like, for example, if I press this one, where did it go? Right? Then you can see that the URL is very different from what we've seen before. So this is basically a built-in server from my IDE, from the PHP Storm. So now it basically still understands how things work based on the relation. See that? Even though we're in a completely different context. So this is now just localhost. We're not in localhost video like here. See that? But I mean, again, pathing is something that we will have more understanding to when we start working with the backend and so on. So I'm not too concerned about that. Yeah, basically we could go into detail now, but I mean, you have now the structure to start playing around with, and I hope you have the possibility to start to Google things. So you need, the basic terminology you understood. So that's a tag name, that's an attribute name, that's an attribute value, and this is like basically everything you need to know in order to find things that you haven't found yet. And yeah, I want to make this actually pretty short, because we will get more hands-on when like we combine at least CSS and JavaScript, because right now it's kind of like, well, what do you want to do? This is just a markup. This doesn't really do anything. I mean, even for this example, I needed to at least have a test PHP in order to facilitate at least somewhat of functionality. So that's basically what you have to understand is HTML is stupid to a certain extent, at least. There are a couple of things that it can somewhat do, but it never leaves the screen, right? This is just okay, just how it's structured. It's not even how it looks like. And that's why I don't want to go in too much detail, because it will make more sense to actually build something with it, and then you will automatically come to the necessities and be able to address them accordingly. So thank you so much for watching. I hope it helped, and please feel free to jump in. I hope you followed along, and enjoy the rest of your day.